Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone, Rabbi Stuart Weinglatt, the chairman of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, to our call today. Very fortunate to have with us David Bernstein. And before I introduce David, just a few general words I'd like to share with everyone. I'm sure many of us had the chance to participate in the outpouring yesterday, the rally for Israel, or as on Tuesday, the rally for Israel, opposing anti-Semitism and also demanding the immediate release of the hostages. In that context, what we're trying to do is to make sure that the message comes through to the administration. Our letter of support for Israel, signed by close to 1,000 rabbis, has been sent to the embassy, which should pass it on with the to the foreign ministry in Israel, as well as just before this call, got a note from the White House asking for a copy of the letter as well. And so, if you haven't yet signed your rabbi, and you haven't yet signed our statement of support for Israel, please be sure to do so. In just a moment, we'll put it up in the chat, and you'll have a chance to go to that link and be able to send it. I also would like to call your attention to the fact that the Christian churches, under the aegis of the American Christian Leaders for Israel, ACLI, is having a very special weekend of prayer for Zion. And in that context, they are tens of thousands of churches around the world are going to be saying a prayer for Israel. So for those colleagues and rabbis who are on this call, we invite you and encourage you, please, before you say the prayer for the state of Israel, take a moment and acknowledge the fact that there are tens of thousands of Christian churches across the world who are going to be reciting a prayer for Zion this particular weekend to show their support and solidarity. And it's an important way of conveying that we are not alone. In that context, please note that the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is looking to sponsor a mission to Israel the 1st of January, immediately after the new year, and we hope some of you will consider joining us. There's a link if you're interested in getting more information in the chat. Please go to that and let us know if you'd like to be a part of what will definitely be an important historic mission. Also, I just want to take this opportunity before we formally begin our program to let you all know that last week's program, which was All Hell is Breaking Out on College Campuses, is on our website and is certainly available to individuals who would like to see it, as well as all the other programs and webinars that we've had as Israel is fighting the war in Gaza, and we're fighting the war in terms of trying to get information out about what's going on. It was on that call last week, in fact, that it was announced that the Israel Campus Coalition, along with the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law, along with ADL and Stand With Us, are joining together and consolidating their forces to fight legally some of the anti-Semitism that is happening on campus. And that happened right here on our call that was revealed and publicly shared. Please know that on Wednesday, November 29, we are considering holding a vigil or a program of some sort in front of the United Nations. And so we'll be sending out more information about that. The 29th of November is the date of the partition, when the partition and establishment of the state of Israel was approved. And then finally, please just continue to spread the word and about the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which seeks to build bridges and whose work is now more important than ever. So with that, I'm going to go straight to our call right now. We're very fortunate to have with us David Bernstein. David may be known to some of you in that he has been the president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. He also had been a director here in Washington in the local office of the American Jewish Committee, and had served as executive director of the David Project. But now, David has founded a new organization. It's called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And he'll share with us a little bit about what they're doing and why it was established. David also most recently wrote a fascinating book. It's called Woke Anti-Semitism, How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. So without any further ado, I want to go to David. And again, just thank you, David, for joining us today. And for being a part of, I think it's very important to hear what you have to say about these topics. And so let me just open up with, giving you the opportunity to share with us what is currently going on in the world that we should be aware of, especially in the progressive world. What's caught us by surprise? What should we not be as surprised about? And again, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful to be here. I already see some familiar faces, so it's wonderful to see you. And I'm excited to have this conversation. Obviously, we're at a very different time. If we held this, 6 weeks ago, it would probably be a different conversation than it is today. So I have, since they gave me screen sharing privileges, I'm going to try. I want to share a visual or two in a very short video of like 30 seconds. But I'd start off with this visual. I know you've all seen the iceberg metaphor, probably used in 100 different PowerPoint presentations. But I think what happens very often when we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about it at the very upper level here. We talk about it at the tip of the iceberg, as it were. And we don't spend enough time below the surface really trying to understand what's happening. Why is anti-Semitism spreading? And it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about and writing about. What are the ideological forces that are providing a permission structure, if you will, for this variant of anti-Semitism that's emerging on the left? Now, I should say, I'm a person of the left. I've spent my whole world career on the sort of center left of the Jewish community. I continue to be, a progressive Zionist and so forth. But I started years ago questioning a shift in discourse that I started to hear, really going back into the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Just in the late 1990s, I was part of a communal program, and there was a multicultural day, and there was a special speaker that was brought in who was a principal of a local high school who was, a multicultural advocate there. And he started off by saying, um, before we even got into the program, racism equals prejudice plus power. And I thought, what is he talking about? I thought racism was the animus toward another racial group. But what he had done is introduced a new definition that has been around for a while, that had been percolating, that racism was not just about prejudice. It was specifically attached to the idea of power. And it immediately hit me that that could be problematic for the Jewish community. It hit me that if racism can only be a function of the powerful, that means that groups that are perceived as powerful, and Jews were among them, wouldn't be eligible for being a victim because we were powerful. And groups that were considered victims couldn't be perpetrators because they're victims. And I wrote an article about it 20 some years ago in our local newspaper, the Washington Jewish Week, warning about this. I got one reply to the article from a guy named Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt, who emailed me and said, "I'm very surprised that somebody from the American Jewish Committee could write that." And full kavod, I think you said it. So I still remember that. But I'm saying that because I want to tell you that I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've been seeing it develop in the circles that I'm a part of. And I think all too often, those of us who have been part of social justice circles, we're like the frogs in the boiling water. We know that the discourse is changing. It might not have been how we thought about it, and we want so badly to be aligned to it. And unfortunately, all of a sudden we wake up after October 7th and we realize we're in a transformed reality, that the people we thought were our friends are advocating for things that are absolutely odious, that are supporting Hamas terrorist attacks or justifying them in some ways. And that's been a long time coming, unfortunately. I want to share with you a video that I'm going to ask you all to, or at least a couple of you to comment on, because I think it really goes to what I'm saying. 1 second. I want to make sure I share the sound here so you can hear. It's only 30 seconds.
Over at the Columbia School of Social Work, students were holding a sit-in in solidarity with Palestine.
Yesterday, we held a 9-hour sit-in at the School of Social Work where we were threatened with sanctions. And today, we're here because it is part of the Shut It Down for Palestine movement that's happening all across the world today. And we are here because we are going to do a die-in. Currently, the School of Social Work uses a prop framework, which is power, race, oppression, and privilege, where we learn about decolonizing social work, which we think is hypocritical when we are being silenced on Palestine, which is a colonized place.
All right. So I want to ask you all, or if anybody has a thought, what does that video does anything jump out at you about that video? Beyond the obvious, here's a young person who is protesting and doing die-ins in the Columbia Social Work School.
What are you looking for, David?
I'm asking you if anything jumps out at you about that. I'm asking you in a second to go to think back at the iceberg metaphor that I gave you, and about what's above the surface and what was below the surface, perhaps, in that video.
Anybody have a response on that? Why don't you just keep going with it, David?
All right. So I did this yesterday for a class that I was teaching, and most of the people really stayed above water, right? They were just talking about what she said about Israel and Palestine, but what they neglected to talk about, what is what she said she was learning in school. She said that they were learning the PROP program in school, which is about privilege, oppression, and the like. I don't remember the exact metaphor. And she said that they're learning to decolonize social work. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean, we think of the word decolonization as referring to, countries such as the former colonial powers, such as Britain, France, and Italy, leaving their former colonies, right? But of course it grows out of this post-colonial ideology that took shape in the last 30 years. But it's more than that. It's this idea that decolonize social work, or decolonize psychology, or decolonize medicine, or decolonize the law means that we are living in a colonial, white supremacist, settler colonial state. That's what we're living in now. Israel's a settler colonial state. The United States is a settler colonial state. And she's being taught, and she is espousing, that to decolonize our curriculum in social work means to understand that that we have to help our clients overthrow the system that is oppressing them. In other words, that's a shift. The old social work paradigm, or the old psychology paradigm, was to help a client empower themselves within the system, to help them understand their own agency. So if you think about cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, it's to help somebody understand that they have power, that they have agency in the world. That's what they did. The new paradigm that's catching on, and that's catching on clearly at Columbia Social Work School, is that actually the system is corrupt and oppressive, and that our job is to help that student raise their critical consciousness, their understanding of systems of oppression around them. And so what she was saying is, my school is hypocritical. They're telling us to decolonize social work. They're telling us that systems of oppression abound. But when all of a sudden, here we are trying to do a die-in in the middle of the social work school without a permit or whatever, and we're told that they can't do that. How hypocritical they are. But I'm going to argue that she's right, that they are hypocritical. And that's the problem, that we've actually conditioned a generation of people, or generations of people, to think in a very specific way, a very simplistic way, to divide up the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed, to believe that all problems, all disparity, all social dynamics are function of that simplistic division, and that that somehow they're not going to start to apply that in ways that are deeply problematic, deeply destabilizing, deeply ugly, deeply offensive, deeply anti-Semitic. And unfortunately, I think some of us, our own organizations, sometimes have bought into this too often, or haven't questioned it. And I think we have to start in-house to a degree. Are we part of the problem? Have we been complicit in an ideology that's spread in our own ranks, that holds the world in very simplistic terms, that itself is fanning the flames of anti-Semitism?
So, David, I want to take this down to be sure we understand exactly what you're saying here. First of all, where does it come from, and when? You're talking about an ideology then, and you're trying to get to the root causes. Tell us a little bit about, just be sure we understand where and when, and how pervasive is it?
Yeah, so this ideology, which started as what you call postmodernism, and I'm sure a few of you took a class in graduate school or whatever in postmodernism, Foucault and Derrida and Marcuse. By the way, these are Jews mostly. It's certainly the Frankfurter School, which is one of the main schools of thought behind this idea of postmodernism. Many of them were German Jews and French Jews and the like. It was sort of, it took off in the late 1960s when a group of protesters at San Francisco State College, which is now San Francisco State University, started protesting their university, demanding that they establish an ethnic studies program at the university that not consonant with the normal academic rigor and approach. And they demanded it was an activist agenda, and its whole purpose was to impart critical consciousness, this idea that systems of oppression are everywhere in every nook and cranny of society. And the school eventually folded and established this program. And within just a few years, there were 1,300 of these ethnic studies programs around the United States. Now, that remained confined to the university setting for most of the past sort of 30, 40 years. But if you educate enough students in something, in this kind of ideology, it starts to leak out of the lab. And I think what we've seen here is that you have a generation of professors and a generation of young people who have come to believe that the world it works in these very simplistic terms. They've managed to get it into, various DEI programs, even at the corporate level. Doesn't mean that these corporate level DEI programs are the same as the most radical forms of this at San Francisco State College. They're not, right? But they're still based on the same binary ideology, the same basic understanding, worldview. And so that caught on. And now about the late 1970s and 1980s, in the works of Edward Said, you might remember Professor Edward Said, who was the Palestinian American professor. He wrote the book Orientalism. He was at Columbia. He took it to the next level. He's the father of post-colonial ideology. This idea that the global North, the colonial powers, are oppressing the global South. And he specifically applied this ideology to the Middle East at that time. There was another thing that was going on here too. And it comes out of the Soviet Union around the exact same time in the late 1960s. And if you want to read more about this, the writer and scholar Isabella Tabarowski has a wonderful article about this in Tablet Magazine, and she's written about it in several scholarly publications. She talks about how the Soviet Union was actively trying in the late 1960s to discredit Zionism. And they created a field called Zionology. And Zionology became instantly popular. There were books that were written about Zionology. And that managed to insinuate itself into this ideology, to insinuate itself into the UN. So hence the 1974 resolution, Zionism is racism. And that later became front and center of post-colonial ideology that was sort of introduced by Edward Said. And so these academic trends really took shape over a course of decades. And you could really start to feel them in 2013, 2014, with the Black Lives Matter riots in Ferguson, Missouri. And then, of course, after George Floyd, it really exploded and became a much more legitimized set of ideas that were popularized by people like Ibram X. Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist, a book probably many of you have seen or read. So I think that's why we're at where we're at today. We've seen a major ideological shift, at least among a certain percentage of our society.
So, David, I understand what you're saying. Then there's this underlying trajectory that started earlier. Do you think there was an intent to take it to the direction that it is now, the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism that exists, or did you think that just kind of unfolded? Certainly, Edward Said made no qualms about his feelings about Jews and Israel and things like that. So was it malicious? Was it intentional? Or is it just kind of a byproduct, so to speak?
Yeah. So the people at the universities, the heads of ethnic studies departments and the like, these are real ideologues, Rabbi. I mean, these are very serious ideologues. They buy into the sort of settler colonialist paradigm. They view, almost to a person, Zionism and Zionists as settler colonialists. And they're very upfront about that. And so among that group of people, it's absolutely intentional. That they actually called it the Long March Through Institutions, which was a term coined by another Jewish intellectual of the late 1960s. And they've been remarkably successful in that long march through institutions. Now, there's a second tier of this, of course. This eventually influences the creation of, let's say, diversity, equity, and inclusion and other programs. And I'm not going to say that the average DEI facilitator at your local law firm or whatever comes in it with that in mind. I don't think that's the case. They've been deeply influenced by the underlying ideology, but they're not. But what it does, even that softer form that we're more familiar with, it conditions us to think in a certain way. It conditions society to think in a certain way, so that young people who have been exposed to that and believe in that are much more likely to buy the harder, more extreme, more egregious paradigm that we see coming out of these universities.
So you mentioned DEI. Let's talk about a couple of other initials: CRT, critical race theory; CSJ, critical social justice. Could you comment on those, please?
Yeah, so critical race theory, also emerged alongside of postmodernism. It also emerged out of the Black Power movement of the late 1960s. So imagine all this ferment in the late 1960s is sort of catching on and spreading in today's ideological environment. And it basically argued that the current legal system that was created post civil rights and the like was not enough to actually transform society, and that we continue to have systems of oppression everywhere. And it taught law students especially to see those systems of oppression. That became one of the main arguments behind a broader movement, which you might call critical social justice. This idea of systems of oppression. Sometimes it's called wokeism, and I know my book is provocatively titled Woke Anti-Semitism. And let me just define that for a second, either critical social justice or wokeism or whatever we choose to call it. I mean two things by that, and I know that some people abuse these words. I mean two things. One is that racism and prejudice are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes, but they're ingrained in the very systems of society. And two, that only people with a lived experience of oppression have the insight to define it for the rest of us. Only those people. So if you're Black, you have insights on racism. If you're Muslim, you have insights on Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. If you're Jews, anti-Semitism, maybe not so much, according to this ideology. Now, I want to say something. Both of these can be true, right? Both of those tenets that I described can be true. It can be true that we have systemic oppression in society, and we've certainly seen that in America. But and it can be true that people with lived experience have some insight that we should all listen to. But they're not always true, and that's what makes them dogmatic. That's what makes them ideological, is they pretend to be able to explain everything, and they try to crowd out every alternative explanation for why the world is the way that it is. And I think that's where we run into the problem. So you can see how that second tenet, that only people with lived experience are qualified, becomes the source of cancel culture. It might say, well, you're a white person. You have no right to really have an independent opinion about racism. You have to listen to what I say because I have standing in the conversation. It becomes a way of shutting people down. But it also becomes a very rigid way to define the world. So if you define the world in purely those terms, and I'll put up another slide here for a second that I think makes the point very well. If you define the world like this is the intersectionality wheel of privilege, right? That you see this at a lot of diversity settings around the country. And it basically says if you look at the inner circle, if you're white, you have more access to power. If you're rich, you have more access to power. If you're a citizen, and it goes around if you can see if you're Black or brown, you have the least access to power. So it rigidly defines who has power and who has privilege in this ideology. Now, Jews are not listed in this wheel of privilege. There might be anti-Semitic versions of it where Jews are livers, but you don't have to talk about Jews. You know where we fit in. You can slot us in here. We are considered white, even if we don't call ourselves white. And so it's through that understanding of power, who has it, it's connecting identity and power and identity and privilege and identity and oppression, where Jews are now viewed as a powerful group and hence not deserving of protection, not deserving of empathy, only can be a perpetrator. And that's why I think we are where we are today, and why so many campuses are willing, while 31 Harvard student groups are willing to sign a statement blaming Israel for the massacre against Israeli citizens.
So in certain respects, I mean, it all seems so academic and so intellectual. Is there a counterbalance to it? And then after that, I'm going to go to a question, a historian, Oren Steinitz has his hand up. So we'll go to you after that. But first, David, I mean, it just seems to be so attractive, so intellectual, so appealing. Is there a intellectual counterbalance to it?
Well, I mean, look, this is not just, and I want to emphasize this is not just another perspective, right? This isn't another operating system. In other words, our basic operating system in a democratic society is liberalism. It's the free exchange of ideas. It's scientific inquiry. It's in Jewish terms, it would be machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. It's our ability to talk to each other, to argue about things, to debate things, and to try to come up find the best approximation of the truth. That's what we mean by liberalism. This seeks to replace liberalism with a power-based system. So we're not up against just another view, we're up against another epistemology, another way of understanding the world in a fundamental sense, another way, a way of talking about and thinking about the world in a fundamental sense. I think that the only way to put is to push back against this, and we could talk about that. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people, left, right, and center, and by the way, there are certainly plenty of leftists, even ardent leftists, who don't like this ideology. Some of them are even have a more of a socialist perspective. They're much more interested in class analysis than they are about race and culture and identity. And so there are plenty of people that I would argue the vast majority of people don't like this ideology. But because we're not organized, and because we haven't band together, because we haven't formed coalitions, we haven't been as strong as we need to be. So yes, there are all kinds of groups that are pushing back. Some are extreme right, which is, I think, can be problematic, because all of a sudden then that anybody who questions it is lumped in with like very right-wing forces and whatever in Florida and the like. But there are plenty of liberals, people who are center left, center right, who don't like this and haven't pushed back but need to.
Okay, Oren, you have a question, please. If you would unmute yourself, go ahead.
Thank you. You kind of briefly discussed this, but one of the issues that I think many of us do buy into this epistemology to a certain extent, right? I cannot say that CRT is complete and utter BS. I think that there's a lot of merit to it, and I think there's a lot of merit to seeing the world through this lens of oppression. However, I think there's a problem when, like you said, when you're starting to disregard people's ideas and thoughts just because of their identity. And of course, as a straight white male, I was told many a times by my students that I have absolutely no right to speak. But the question is, how can we form these coalitions, or how can we form some sort of a resistance to that and not get lumped in with racist, homophobic, misogynistic forces?
David?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's an excellent question. First of all, let me just say that I agree with you that critical race theory, it's a lens, as you put it. I think that's exactly right. It's a theoretical lens that can have utility as long as it's not imposed upon everybody. In other words, if it's one way of looking at the world that is brought into the conversation, it may have unique insights. It does have unique insights that we should pay attention to. And I would argue that, even the epistemology, what's called standpoint epistemology, the idea that people with lived experience have unique insight, can be true. Like, as a Jew who grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in the 1970s and 80s, I had a lot of coins thrown at my feet and swastikas written in my books. And I think I have something to say about anti-Semitism that a non-Jewish person should listen to. But I don't have the final word. I mean, you're all Jews, and you might not have experienced anti-Semitism in the same way I did. So I don't get to speak for all Jews about the experience of anti-Semitism. And also, there are other data points besides lived experience. So in 2019, when the Pew study came out with a report that American Jews are the most admired religious community in America, I have to take that seriously as well, because it's an important data point. And if I'm a liberal, if I'm open to alternative views, I will. But this ideology too often behaves what the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls cuckoo. And he doesn't mean crazy. He means it behaves like a cuckoo bird, which takes over another bird's nest and kicks out all its eggs. In other words, it seeks to be a monopoly over the discourse. That's the problem. It's not the lens, Oren. It's the rabbi. It's the claim. It's the claim of the monopolistic claim that it makes.
So, David, I want to focus on this, though, in terms of, especially after October 7th, and even before that is when we began to see some of these ebbing away. Many within the Jewish community assume these are our natural allies in the progressive community. We, with Black Lives Matter, people weren't so sure which way to go with that. Certainly in terms of as a phrase, it made sense. But now we've seen in terms of some of the actual organization or the movement known as Black Lives Matter, that there have been anti-Semitic statements that have come out of it, anti-Zionist statements about it. But in some respects, again, going back to what I said before, it looks like, and of course with the intersectionality and prohibiting Jews from participating in some different movements with which we would be sympathetic. Were we just, asleep at the wheel? Were we not, understanding what happened and so on? Again, trying to understand it from that perspective, David.
Yeah, I think we were asleep at the wheel. I think we should have known it was coming. I think we should have spent more time trying to understand it. There was this great quote by a Jewish woman in the New York Times, a progressive, who said, I woke up to and I realized I was part of an organization that supported poor people, reproductive rights, and Hamas.
Huh.
The signs were there. We were just scared. Like, look, if we were paying attention, we would understand that a simplistic ideology that divides everybody up as either oppressed or oppressor is not going to be good for us. It's been around for a long time. But we as Jews, and I understand this because I'm of the mind, who see ourselves as part of the modern day civil rights movement and the like, we want to remain connected to progressives. We feel safer among progressives. When we look at, an Alex Jones or, a right-wing political figure, it tends to scream out to us Cossack, right? These are the people who are our enemies. But Jews have always been more susceptible to the Cossacks on the left than we have the right. I mean, going back to, the sort of early 20th century, I mean, Jews have always were willing to dismiss Stalin's sins. Many Jews, obviously not a majority, but some percentage, to be part of the communist movement, which they still thought it promised, universal redemption. And so I think we're much more susceptible to ideology on the left because we see ourselves as part of the left. We want to be part of the left. We want to be part of the modern day civil rights movement. But of course, things changed, and we didn't understand that they were changing, and now we're seeing that they changed, and we have to regroup.
So, David, in terms of this intellectual aspect, then again, we're talking about where it comes from and how it's done. I want to go back to so what recourse is there? What is the possible ways to deal with some of this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to address what Oren actually asked for a second here, which was,
Yes.
Are we in danger of becoming lumped in with the far right? And I think the answer is, well, only if we don't speak out. In other words, I founded the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values 2.5 years ago. And of course, my first target audience are center-left people who care about these issues, care about society, care about disparity. And yet they're the most reluctant to speak out because they want to remain in good standing on the left. So they say, David, you're right. I agree with you. I'm feeling the same thing, but I won't sign that rabbi's letter that you had because I'm just not willing to go there, right? I don't want to be lumped in. And so if people on the left are so worried about being lumped in, Jews, moderate, thoughtful people are so worried about being lumped in with a Ron DeSantis or whoever, Chris Rufo or whoever else, then we're not going to be able to create our own liberal movement to oppose this. And believe me, there are plenty of liberals who do oppose it, and many of them are public. Many of the great intellectual thought leaders of our time are people who oppose this ideology. But we have to be willing to take some chances, which really goes to your question, Rabbi, about taking risks here. Look, the far left wing has managed to create what some sociologists call spirals of silence, right? Where people are afraid to speak out, and it creates the impression that these shrill voices are actually larger than they are. And so in order to overcome that, we have two things were required. Number one is that thoughtful people have to speak out and take risks, and not worried about being canceled or whatever. We have to take risks. And the second thing is we have to work together. We have to find each other. I have to know who among you agrees and is willing to take a risk so that I know who to reach out to so that we can take a risk together. Because the more people who band together, the less risky it is. That's one way you change this dynamic. The other way I've discovered is what I call expanding the scope of the referendum. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Columbia University, right after October 7th, a group of Columbia professors writes a letter, I think 90 of them or so, 100 of them, basically holding Israel responsible for the entire Gaza situation. And it would be easy to say that that's the final commentary. Look at all those Columbia professors who hate us, right? But then another professor, Jewish professor, wrote an alternative letter that was signed by nearly 300 Columbia professors. And it exposed the other letter, the first letter, as the minority view. And I think that's why we've got to expand the scope of the referendum so that people understand that you're not small. But the only way to do that is to take the risks involved, to band together and to start to expose the radicals in our midst. This is really taking hold in certain places like California. It is, as I said, it escaped the lab. It is now in the form of ethnic studies in California in K through 12 education. And I can tell you, even there, a lot of the Jewish organizations that I've worked for and I've worked with want to reconcile themselves to ethnic studies. Well, yes, we don't want the most explicitly anti-Semitic versions of the ethnic studies to take hold. So we'll fight that. But if they're going to teach our kids decolonial theory and they're going to teach our kids settler colonial theory, we're going to go along with that because we don't want to make waves. And I'm saying that that's the wrong compromise. We made a compromise that we shouldn't have made, and we have to go back and reconsider that.
So I think a lot of it has to do with, hearing you correctly, with our desire to be accepted within progressive liberal circles, our desire not to be ostracized, and that there's a natural alliance. And I mean, we feel that in many respects, and yet there obviously is a double standard when it comes to Israel.
There's a double standard, and some sectors, depending on how far left you go, there's a hostility. There's just blatant hostility. I mean, I just spoke to you about ethnic studies out of California. Many of the professors that are spreading this curriculum in California now nationally, they came out on day one. I'm talking October 8th. Day one, they came out with memes on Instagram, praising the resistance, and with a hand glider memes and the like. So I think we've been asleep at the wheel, as you implied earlier, and it means that we have to take a deep breath. We have to hit the pause button and ask ourselves, who are our friends? What are our interests? How do we work toward a kind of society in which Jews are going to thrive? Those are questions we've always asked ourselves, but I think now we're not answering them in the correct way. We're sort of been on autopilot all these years, doing the same kinds of things with the same type of groups. We have a lot of sunk costs in all these progressive coalitions. And again, I'm not saying cut off ties with your progressive allies. There are probably many of them that are wonderful friends that you should continue to work with. But when somebody says that either you have to agree with my decolonial ideology, or you have to agree that America is a pervasively, systematically racist place, I think that's the time when we say, I'm sorry, but that's not my belief. And if that means that they're no longer your friends, so be it.
Now, is it was October 7th or October 8th for many people, was kind of a wake-up call. What did you sense with that, David, in terms of responses from different certain quarters?
Well, certainly I've gotten a lot of messages from people, some of whom have apologized. One of the leading diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitators in the country. He's somebody who's been really front and center in that movement, who has sparred with me publicly many times. He's Jewish, wrote me a note, and he asked for my forgiveness. He didn't do it publicly, by the way. He did it privately, for his dismissal and his stubbornness at considering the possibility that ideology in his camp might lead to anti-Semitism. I've heard from various Jewish professionals and the like, most often quietly, not always publicly, sometimes publicly, that they think that it's time to reconsider. Rabbi Sharon Brous, who has been, a sort of a passionate advocate of progressive causes, gave a very stirring sermon. And while she didn't end up where I end up on these questions, she certainly called a spade a spade. She said that they've linked Jews to power in a way that's extremely distortive of their thinking. You can see that it was actually cited in a New York Times article right after October 7th. So I think a lot of left-wing Jews, progressive Jews, even a few anti-Zionist Jews, were shocked at how callous the people that they had made common cause were.
Getting back to what we talked a little bit about before, DEI, I have right here an article from here in our local area, Montgomery County, which is where you live as well. A DEI teacher in a Jewish area, the headline says Jews kill Palestinians to sell their organs. What's happening in the DEI community in general, and how is that a threat to Jews?
So diversity, equity, inclusion has turned into a field, right? It's not just some practice that we engage in our universities and in our workplaces and the like. It's a field, right? And it is built upon an ideological framework. We have to be honest about that. It is built upon the ideological framework I talked about. It is a theory of power, who has it and who doesn't, and how that power manifests itself in our institutions. And the idea is to reverse power dynamic. Now, again, and going back to what Oren said before, that's not to say that there aren't some insights there, that sometimes power does manifest itself in ways that should give us pause and we should reverse or push back at. But what it does do is it brings in a certain kind of bureaucrat, a certain kind of professional into the field who tend to have certain attitudes about the world. Very often they're more radical than everybody else in their workplace or their community. And they very often have disparaging views of Jews in Israel. And we know this, there's been some studies about it. There was a study that was done by the Heritage Foundation that looked at Twitter tweets from the DEI professionals on college campuses and found that they were overwhelmingly hostile to Israel. So I think we know that this is an embedded problem within diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think we have a real problem in our hands. I just want to show you all another slide for a second that sort of makes the point here. 1 second, I'll get to the right one. Okay, here it is. All right. This is a slide that a Jewish teacher who goes to our shul rabbi, shared with me that came out of their pedagogy, their diversity, equity, and inclusion training that they were going under in the Montgomery County public school system. And it is a picture of the neo-Nazis and Charlottesville, right? The tiki torches. And this is what it says: being honest with ourselves. Did we look at this image and think that's not me, or I am not that kind of white person, or not all white people are like those white people? Do we want to view ourselves as good white people and distance ourselves from bad white folks? How does this good-bad binary get in the way of accepting that we are participants and reinforcers of a system of white supremacy? Now, I want you to think about this for a second. These people are protesting outside or outside of a synagogue. Outside of a synagogue, where there are cowering Jews or fearful Jews who are in that synagogue at the time. And what this does is it says there's no difference for those people outside the synagogue with their tiki torches and you white Jews who are in it. Now, I understand that that's not explicitly stated, but I want to understand how this pedagogy and this DEI curriculum can condition people to think in a certain way, right? This comes out of a framework called white supremacy culture that holds that norms like being on time to work or school are white supremacy values and should be done away with. And I know that sounds crazy, and it sounds like, it's a small minority of people believe it. It is a small minority of people believe it. It is being taught to every teacher in our school district.
Right, David, I've heard some of that kind of stuff. And first of all, I mean, as I'm thinking about this, a couple things. Number one, it seems like there's a funneling to draw us to a certain conclusion, as it was in that slide you just showed to us, that you've got to come that way. And number two is I've also heard this about coming to work on time now is some kind of white power thing. So, I mean, where's this going to take us to? Everyone would, show up late for work. Everyone's going to be on Jewish Standard Time. I don't understand what's going to, where do we go with this?
We're all Jewish organizations now. No, I think that people have to be willing to fight back. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. We have to take risks and we have to push back. It's not enough to push back against the anti-Semitism. Here's my thesis, Rabbi. It's not enough to push back against the anti-Semitism. These are structural problems. And they're structural problems that grow out of the ideology, of the underlying ideology. We are stuck with the anti-Semitism until this ideology becomes a marginal force in society. If this ideology is dominant in institutions, we are stuck with the anti-Semitism it produces. And that's why when people talk about what do university presidents need to do, we can come up with 100 different short-term answers of how they can protect Jewish students and the like. But ultimately, they're going to have to change their fundamental approach to teaching and thinking if they're going to be places where Jews feel safe and Jews are safe and that are supporting the norms of a democratic society.
So let's talk about the college campus situation. It's within a couple of contexts. Number one, from what I'm hearing from you, is it's so pervasive within the behavioral science area and in the liberal arts. Maybe one of the answers is to make sure everyone just becomes a math and engineer majors. I don't know, but it seems as if it's almost the mindset and the default position. So we've got that coming there. And are you connecting the dots that when we see these demonstrations on college campuses and things like that, that this is an outgrowth of that? And then my follow-up question to that would be, which I'll ask now, how much of it has to do with the immigration that's taken place, or the prevalence of Muslim student organizations on campus, many of whom come from overseas?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, there's very few things I can say close to 100% confidence. And I think I can say pretty close to 100% confidence that the protests on campus are an outgrowth of the ideology that's been taught in universities for the last 50 years. I mean, there's just no question in my mind that the language that's used, the decolonization language, is completely reflective of those ideological precepts that grow out of the modern university, that grew out of the studies departments in campuses. So absolutely. Now, by the way, when you have Muslim students and Arab students studying, they may just have student visas. They may not be, permanent immigrants and the like. What I think in the larger sense is happening is what's often called the Red-Green Alliance. It's the alliance between left-wing ideology and Islamic fundamentalism, or Islamism. And that's been in Europe for like 20, 30 years. It's been a force in Europe, but it has actually found its way to American shores. And so in the last decade, Qatar has invested about $10 billion into American university systems. By the way, just to give you a sense, if you add how many Qataris are there? Well, I think Qatar, maybe the population's around 3 million, but there's only about 300,000 or so actual Qataris. And they're investing huge sums of money to influence the discourse in this country, and they've been remarkably successful. So I think it's the convergence of money coming out of the Arab world. Of course, some of the Muslim students and Arab students are activists, and they're empowered by this progressive ideology that sees them as victims.
So how do we deprogram them, David? Because sometimes I've heard these people and they're just reciting mantras. It's so clear, that they don't really know or understand anything about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so on and so forth. And they just seem to be so devoid of facts.
Yeah, we're not going to deprogram them. What we can do is we can strengthen everybody else's voices around them, because they're a small minority. It's not every kid on campus is walking around with a Palestinian flag screaming from the river to the sea. That's a small minority of people, but they're dominant, and they can completely change the environment for a Jewish student. So I think what we have to do is we have to strengthen everybody else's voices. We have to, and that's the longer, bigger challenge in front of us. It's not going to happen just because we push back against those protests, or because the university president, I hope they will call it, anti-Semitism or extremism. It's not going to happen because we, educate a few Jewish students alone. It's going to happen because we educate society that this radicalism is dangerous and that we need to push back.
So what about the aspect of, we often hear about sort of the free speech, whether it was the, Rashida Tlaib, those who members of Congress who felt, well, we can't really vote to condemn her, or aspects on campuses. Is that a valid concern, or is that a valid comment for those who are fighting the anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so I'm a free speecher, right? I'm somebody who wants to see the free exchange of ideas in society. So this is obviously puts us all, anyone who values free speech, in a very challenging dilemma. Because on the one hand, we want our universities to be bastions of free speech. In fact, in the universities that have the highest free speech values, they have the less amount of anti-Semitism. Places that you're seeing with the most anti-Semitism right now are the places that the organization FIRE has found in survey data have the least amount of free speech. University of Pennsylvania is the most hostile free speech environment in the United States because it is the most ideological campus, along with Columbia and Stanford and Harvard in the United States. These are places that are the most ideological, they're the most hostile to alternative views, and they're the most anti-Semitic.
And yet, wouldn't they claim to be the most open?
They might claim it, but they're not. And you can see that by their actions. Now, so what does that leave us? Does that mean that we should be free speech absolutists and push very hard for free speech? Or should we push back and insist that the university grant Jews equal protection so that Jews are protected by the same speech codes that everybody else is? And we find ourselves, I think, stuck in that very challenging dilemma between our value of free speech versus the value of equal protection. And so I don't have easy answers to that. I want there to be a free speech environment, and I want to make sure Jewish students have all the protections that are extended to every other minority group in this country. But sometimes you have to pick sides on that.
So, David, in terms of, what are the bright spots out there right now? But whether it's colleges and or combating this and or success in terms of trying to, dismantle some of these impressions, because if we're talking about an academic approach and an academic ideology, it's just so dominant. What have you seen any things that are particularly successful, whether it's even in colleges or even, it starts even before that in some of our high school systems?
Yeah, so there is much more pushback against this now than there was 3 years ago when this really went off the rails, right? And there's a new university called the University of Austin that just got its accreditation, that is founded upon free exchange of ideas. It is based on that, and it is a reaction to the stifling ideological environment on campus. Many universities in the United States are now trying to create centers of free exchange. And I think that they have a very valuable role to play. It may be that the whole university should be a center for free exchange, but if it's not, let's start with a single center that then becomes dominant because it attracts more of the best and brightest students. So I think it's in efforts like this, we're seeing that. I think the Ohio University system just committed itself to embrace these centers of free exchange of ideas and the like. At Yale Law School, which has been a big problem spot, there's now going to be a center for academic freedom and so forth. Again, these are in their very early stages, and it's the kind of structural changes that I think can work. There's a lot of times when we've been able to push back successfully. Like, I don't want to make this sound like we're always failing. In California, where this is spreading in the K-12 system, we've very often gone to the school systems and said, do you know what the people who are pushing this version of the curriculum believe? This is what they believe, and we show them their statements and so forth, and they get their contracts severed. So we can win, but we've got to be very organized, because we're up against a real juggernaut,
which has a lot of financial backing as well. And one of the things is, we were alerted in an article by Gil Troy, the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, to the Association of Women's Studies, who came out with a just absolutely ridiculous statement after October 7th, talking about the oppression of Palestinian women without a single word about the murder and rape of women in Hamas. Our colleague who's on the call, Rabbi Lisa Malik, has drafted a very strong statement, which the ZRC will be issuing, condemning the American Women's Studies Group for their insensitivity.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that going on right now. These are academic departments that they're political activist departments. They don't adhere to the normal norms of the academy. They're not about free exchange of ideas. They're about platforming ideologues and ideas that are consonant with that worldview. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean there's no version of liberal women's studies or liberal gender studies. There are, like, for example, the Black Studies Department at Harvard, which is led by Henry Louis Gates, I think the third. He practices the free exchange of ideas. His department, Black Studies Department, does adhere to a traditional academic scholarly approach. But a lot of these studies departments, ethnic studies departments, gender studies departments, are activist departments. And if their pride of place is not knocked down a few notches, then we're going to be stuck with this ideology for a long time to come.
So again, but getting back to something you touched upon a little bit before, one of the fears or concerns when people oppose some of this stuff is the concern with being labeled with being right-wing. And among all the sins that a Jew could possibly be accused of, for which they won't want to be associated with, it's that one. Yes, David?
Yeah, I have a funny story. I spoke at a major synagogue in LA. I won't name the synagogue. I probably could, but I'm not. A few weeks ago. And when I showed up at the synagogue, there was something odd going on. I couldn't find a flyer about the program. There was nothing on the website about the program. And the rabbi decided to not facilitate. And I didn't know what was going on. And it turned out that there had been sort of a cancellation campaign about my visit, because my book, which is called Woke Anti-Semitism: How a Progressive Ideology harms Jews is provocatively titled, and that meant that certain people were offended by it. And they also confused me with another David Bernstein, who's a scholar at George Mason University, who had articles that were viewed as right-wing, who's, by the way, an excellent scholar who shouldn't be canceled either. So I think the Jewish community has a lot of work to do here. Like, we've got to open up the conversation ourselves. We are not fighting anti-Semitism. You are not fighting anti-Semitism if you are not having this conversation that we're having right now in the open in your own congregations with your own people. And there will be people who don't like it. But by the way, I will tell you, I've spoken at numerous synagogues around the United States. I've spoken in many federations and JCCs and the like. Not once have I ever actually faced a heckler. With all the hand-wringing about all this, and the vast majority of people in any room sort of go along with it, understand it's a problem. And there's often constructive questions, and that's wonderful, by the way. I could be wrong about some of this, and I want to hear constructive feedback about it. So I think that there's an opportunity to discuss this, and if we can't do it in the wake of October 7th, when can we? Bret Stephens coined the term the October 8th Jew. The October 8th Jew. What does the October 8th Jew come to recognize about his or her world? And I would argue that the October 8th Jew is much more serious about this threat coming from the left. What does an October 8th synagogue look like? What is an October 8th rabbi like? How is an October 8th rabbi going to change the conversation and start to look at things a little differently and challenge his congregation to question some of their core beliefs around these issues and their core political commitments? And that's not to say that the Jews should go and join MAGA. I'm not a MAGA guy. I'm just telling you right up front. I mean, I'm somebody who's still very much part of the center left. But that doesn't mean we have to go along with radical ideologies in our own backyard just because there are radical ideologies on the other side. We should commit to rebuilding the center in our own community and rebuilding the center in American society.
So, David, first, if anybody has any last questions, please feel free to put it in. We're going to be wrapping up our conversation in just a few moments. But I do want to ask, and there was one other question I wanted to ask about what has changed since October 7th. I did not see Bret's article. Could you please define what is an October 8th Jew?
Yeah, an October 8th Jew is a Jew who understands that many of his or her political commitments might have been challenged as a result of what happened on October 7th. They awoke to a reality in which many of their former allies were praising Hamas or simpatico with Hamas or unwilling to criticize Hamas. And it's a different existential reality. And the October 8th Jew starts to ask questions about their Jewish community and of themselves, about where they fit in politically, intellectually, and the like. He's also, it's in a column that he wrote. He first talked about it at a conference a few weeks ago that I was at, and he wrote about it in one of his most recent columns. And you can find it on the New York Times website. So I'd urge you to read that. It's an important article, an important way of thinking about our current challenge.
David, you and I wrote a call just about 2 weeks ago with Natan Sharansky, and Sharansky had said that you were right. What was he referring to?
Yeah, so Natan Sharansky, I was very honored, wrote the foreword to my book, a very excellent foreword, by the way, to my book about the dangers he saw in woke ideology, and Natan Sharansky is part of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, and there was some opposition to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement around a video that they produced called Woke Anti-Semitism. And Natan, who's the chair of that organization, got involved in that. And many Jewish organizations said that they were going to pull out of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement because they used that term and because they made that video. And Sharansky was very frustrated by all of this. And Sharansky, at that meeting that we were both at, said, "Is David Bernstein here?" He goes, "You are vindicated." So I felt very good. I mean, of course, everybody wants to hear that from Natan Sharansky. But I do believe that there are a lot of other people who understand now that this is an important stance to take.
Great.
I saw Eric Fussfield had his my longtime friend Eric Fussfield wanted to ask a question. I don't know if there's time for that, but
yeah, go. Well, Eric, if you want to ask a question quickly and just unmute. You're still muted, Eric. Go for it. You're still muted,
Eric.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Yeah,
David.
I mean,
yeah.
okay. You you've touched on another thing, a number of things that have been bothering me, because I was texting this morning with a friend about you remember very well the Black Lives Matter at New York Times ad 3 years ago that more than 600 Jewish groups signed on to, despite, plenty of evidence of anti-Semitism in the Black Lives Matter movement, because the feeling was, well, come on, that's not their main focus. We really need to unite in favor of racial justice, et cetera, as though anti-Semitism didn't really matter. And it was like this, we arrived as a community at this position, like with a large measure of shame and deference, like, come on, we really need to support them. And, with regard to the October 8th Jew, is this the kind of thing that's going to shake us out of that mindset, at least to the point where we elevate anti-Semitism as a consideration in choosing our allies and not minimize the threat that it poses to us, and demand, as we're entitled to, that our allies recognize anti-Semitism as a major concern?
So let me use that as our framing of our last question, and I want to just add something to what Eric was just pointing out, and that is, in some of the conversations I have with some rabbis on other things, it seems as if there is a tendency to forgive the anti-Semitism on the left, to be very non-forgiving of anti-Semitism on the right, to try and come up with excuses. There was just something happening in the Washington, D.C. Area, and because it was from an organization from the left that had said some things that weren't, said, well, let's try and work with them, let's try and talk with them. Had that been from somebody from the right, there would have been absolutely no tolerance. So within our own community, trying to understand that, just piggyback on Eric's question, with that, we'll wrap up our conversation. David, the last words.
Yeah, I think that's right, Eric. But I would actually add, not only shouldn't we tolerate anti-Semitism from our erstwhile allies, we shouldn't tolerate extremism, extreme ideological pronouncements that would that that view America in a certain way as well, because that is what, in my view, leads to the anti-Semitism we're talking about. And so too often Jewish groups will say, well, they weren't anti-Semitic explicitly, so we'll go along and we'll join their coalition or we'll support their letter. And I think that that's what gets us in trouble. Before you know it, we find out we've actually been sitting in the same room with people who supported Hamas, because we didn't have an ideological litmus test in place in the first place. Look, as far as Black Lives Matter goes, I don't know what it is. I know that Black lives actually do matter, and I feel that very strongly. Is it a set of protests that took place around 2000? That's one thing. Is it a set of organizations like the Movement for Black Lives or the Black Lives Matter organization? That's another thing. Is it my pastor that I took, my local pastor that I took to Israel, who loves Israel and takes his congregants to Israel every single year, who has the sign on his lawn that says Black Lives Matter? Is that what we mean by Black Lives Matter? So I don't know what we really mean when we say Black Lives Matter. I think it's complicated. But what I do know is that some people who purport to speak on the behalf of Black Lives Matter, including that Chicago chapter that came out with that horrific meme celebrating the murders of Jews with a hang glider, I do know that those aren't our friends. And so I think we should be very careful about what we support, what we don't support. I think we should ask a lot of questions. I think we should push back much, much harder than we have before. I don't think, Rabbi, that we should tolerate anti-Semitism from the left any more than we do from the right. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we shouldn't sometimes forgive people on the right or the left. There's a role for forgiveness. There's a role for helping people come to terms with their own anti-Semitism. We can do that. Rabbis are especially good at that, but we should regard them as equal threat. Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL used to say that anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane,
Right,
and anti-Semitism on the left is like climate change. In other words, a hurricane is violent, it's immediate, causes tremendous damage right up front. Climate change is corrosive and slow moving. And I think that I used to agree with that, by the way. I used to say that's right. And I would say, Jonathan, you're only leaving one thing out, though. You're not telling us what the ideological CO2 emissions that are causing the climate change on the left. You are on the right. We know what's happening on the right and why it's happening, but you're not on the left. But now I can't even use that metaphor, because what we're seeing on the left is not a hurricane, it's a tsunami. And I think so to treat that as if it's somehow ameliorative, and to treat anti-Semitism on the right as beyond the pale, I think is a mistake. And I think that's part of what it means to be an October 8th Jew, is to take anti-Semitism on the left very seriously.
just in conclusion, one of the things I want to say is that I think we also have to be willing to accept embrace and friendship when there are those who want to embrace us. At the rally on Tuesday in Washington, Reverend Hagee gave a very strong, impassioned speech, and yet one of my colleagues afterwards said, and seemed to be very disappointed about the fact that that was who was speaking on behalf of the Christian community. And so I think we have to be able to recognize those who are not anti-Semites and to encourage that. In that context, I want to wrap up our conversation here. One or two quick things, and that is just to remind people to please be sure to check our website, to be added to our mailing list, or to be a supporter or a member of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, so we can continue to do the kind of important work that we're doing, and looking out into the possibility of a mission to Israel on January 1st, as well as all the other kinds of things we're doing. David, if somebody wants to follow up with you, what's the best way to reach you?
They can reach me on my email, david@jilv.org, david@jilv.org, or they can reach my phone number, and I'll put in the chat, is you can always call me, because I know you'll...
That's very generous of you, David.
Yeah, I love to be in touch. I'm sorry. There we go. 301-452-8136. And yeah, please be in touch. I'd be happy to talk.
Thank you so much. And my email is sweinblatt@zionistrabbis.org. Thank you, everyone. And we wish everyone an early happy Thanksgiving. Thank you, David. Great
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thanks.
This will be posted on our website along with the other ones that we've done in recent weeks as well. Thank you.
There are going to be over 500 actions today around the country in response to a call to shut it down for Palestine. Last week, we saw the biggest march for Palestine in U.S. history, but we can't go down to D.C. every week. Some people can't make it. So now the organizers have called on people to organize demonstrations in their own localities, at their workplaces, at their institutions, and are calling on people to do whatever they can to stop business as usual. Right now, we're at the BlackRock headquarters in New York City. It's about 8:30, and we've been tipped off that there's going to be a disruption inside.
Company, one of the largest asset managers in the world. BlackRock has billion-dollar investments in the top 5 weapons manufacturers in the world. Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. And those bombs, those weapons, have killed this incredibly long list that now actually must be longer because there are over 10,000 Palestinians dead in just 1 month. There is no excuse for anyone to be going about their business as usual when their offices are paying for the slaughter of children, men, women who have done nothing except demand their right to resist brutal occupation.
On the other side of town, students at Fort Hamilton High School were preparing to walk out in solidarity with Palestine.
We looked at the toolkit that was provided with us, and we decided 11:30 would be probably the best time. And then I decided that I really wanted to make it bigger, so I spread it to the clubs. And
there's supposed to be a national walkout today.
Yeah,
people aren't supposed to be going to their jobs. Students are supposed to be walking out of the schools. It's not just our school. It's supposed to be a national thing. So
that's how we first
heard of it, and then we brought it to our school.
Honestly, we were handing out posters and lunch. We were just trying to get as many people to help on as we could.
We were getting everyone who had Instagram, anyone who had any sort of social media, to just post about it so that we can get as many people to come 11:30, 6th period.
When the conflict with Ukraine happened, our school was so supportive. We had posters all over the hallways.
People were able to talk about it.
People were able to talk about it,
and we had charity. But suddenly, when we want to raise money for people in Gaza, for children in Gaza, they're villainized. It's a religious issue. We're going to offend the other side.
Just because I'm not from Palestine, just because I'm not from the region, does not mean I can't show my support for it. You won't find any of the true answers, any of the real experiences from people there in Western media. You need to look elsewhere.
Some of the high schools that didn't walk out spent their lunches phone banking Congress. Over at the Columbia School of Social Work, students were holding a sit-in in solidarity with Palestine.
Yesterday, we held a 9-hour sit-in at the School of Social Work where we were threatened with sanctions. And today, we're here because it is part of the Shut It Down for Palestine movement that's happening all across the world today. And we are here because we are going to do a die-in. Currently, the School of Social Work uses a prop framework, which is power, race, oppression, and privilege, where we learn about decolonizing social work, which we think is hypocritical when we are being silenced on Palestine, which is a colonized place.
Students from across the city were gathering at Bryant Park for a rally, but while they were doing that, I went over to the New York Times headquarters where media workers were planning disruption in the lobby. I'm in the New York Times headquarters right now, and protesters have just read out the names of journalists murdered by Israel, and now they're reading from these newspapers with the names of thousands of Gazans that have been murdered in the last month by Israel. And as you can see behind me, they are completely occupying the lobby, and they're also joined by protesters outside that are supporting them. During the disruption, we spoke to one of the organizers, Ari Brostoff, a senior editor at Jewish Currents magazine.
When we see the newspaper of record doing an abysmal job at their own job, then we as their colleagues have to stand up and say that.
Eventually, the police were called, but the protesters kept reading names anyway. The NYPD Strategic Response Group is behind me. They're the arrest teams of the NYPD. And the protesters here have been reading off the names of Gazans killed by Israel, starting with the youngest. And right now, 45 minutes in, they're at 4-year-olds. While all this was happening, the march at Bryant Park had grown to well over 10,000 protesters and was headed to the New York Times headquarters. By the time they reached the New York Times building, the anger was palpable.
Shame on you! 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 Shame on you!
This was probably the most active day of protests in New York City since the beginning of Israel's massacre, but it doesn't even begin to capture the full scope of November 9th. Actions were held in every major city across the country. There was a protest at Debbie Stabenow's office in Detroit, a walkout at the University of Georgia, a picket in front of Textron, a military contractor in Providence, a protest outside of Congressman Deborah Ross's office in Raleigh, walkouts in Pittsburgh, a walkout in Tucson, the complete shutdown of the federal building in San Francisco, activists in D.C. surrounded the State Department, Boston crashed a fundraiser for Kamala Harris, New Jersey occupied Cory Booker's office, healthcare workers in Philly had a die-in at City Hall, Cleveland shut it down, Denver shut the state Capitol building down, Atlanta had an overnight sit-in at the Israeli consulate, veterans occupied congressional offices. One of Senator Elizabeth Warren's constituents, who's lost family in Gaza, confronted her while she was at dinner. Code Pink even disrupted Joe Biden, and that was just the US. Internationally, there were actions in Italy, Morocco, El Salvador, Canada, Japan. In total, there were 600 actions that took place worldwide in one day. In the last few weeks, I've heard a lot of people say they feel powerless to do anything about Israel's massacre. But nothing could be further from the truth. Israel's war machine relies entirely on a litany of institutions outside of its borders. It relies on banks and financial institutions that invest in it. It relies on media outlets echoing its lies. It relies on politicians that rubber stamp and unconditionally support its crimes. It relies on universities and schools that lie to their students about the situation. It even relies on restaurants and coffee shops and actors and musicians to give it cultural cover to make people think people actually support it. In other words, it relies on us. It relies on institutions we patronize, institutions we work for, and we can withdraw our support whenever we want. We can even stop them from functioning whenever we want. After all, how can a university continue to support Israel if all of its students support Palestine and won't go to class or won't pay tuition until the university supports Palestine? How can a media organization continue to function if its reputation is synonymous with genocide denial and parroting war propaganda? How could a politician hope to get reelected if they get heckled and mocked and laughed out of every room they step in? And that's what this Global Day of Action shows, that this is all actually completely in our hands, and that when we all act together on the same day, in the same coordinated fashion, our fear melts away, and the things we once thought were impossible no longer seem so far away. In many ways, it feels like this latest Israeli massacre has actually awoken a sleeping giant. The November 9th call to action was issued to disrupt business as usual, and another day of action is already being planned for November 17th. The question of what happens next is no longer just in the hands of governments. The question of what happens next won't be decided for us by some outside force. What happens next depends entirely on us, and whether or not we finally decide that we've had enough with business as usual.